All right, this is the lesson one of Unit 6. Human activities cause changes in the environment. I'm going to try to make these videos shorter than the last ones because, honestly, these are things that we kind of talk about in science a lot. So I'm just going to try on and hit on the most important things. So one of the things that this talks about is we have this picture of farmlands and then an algae bloom, and it talks about an algae bloom is when conditions are ever so perfect in water, and algae, a type of like a kind of like a plant, single-celled organism, uh, starts reproducing really quickly, and as it reproduces, it essentially uses up all the oxygen and can kill off larger things like fish. And it just asks, how are the lands and oceans connected? So I said that they're connected by the coasts, and all the water from land will eventually go into the oceans. And what do you think might cause algae to start growing very rapidly? And I said, because things like fertilizers or other chemicals or whatever, something from the land is washing off into the water and will cause the water conditions to change. So one, exploring the environment. This talks about how might a beaver use or depend on some environmental factors. So you have to say whether these are living or non-living, which seems pretty straightforward. And so I said, I used all of these actually. I said the beaver obviously breathes air and it needs water to live, but it also is living in the water. So beavers build dams with trees and grasses and stuff. They build these giant dams, and the reason that they build the dams is actually to get like fish and food and other things closer to them. And so they build these dams and live under them, and then the water is actually run off from mountains like these ones in the back. Describe the environment of the algae shown at the beginning of the lesson. How is algae connected to the environment? So algae is connected to the environment because it's always present, right? But something happens to the environment that will make the algae grow. It's not like algae is just sitting there and all of a sudden goes, hey, I think today I'll grow a lot faster than normal and kill everything off. That's not what's happening. It's something in the environment is changing. So changes in the environment. This says look at the images and changes. Compare this tornado with the deforestation. So some things I said, in this tornado, you can see how there's still a lot of stuff living here. It just kind of took out the biggest, loosest things. It kind of like cleared away the branches from the trees, but the main parts of the trees, the trunks in a lot of cases are still standing up. So you can see there's like still some shade. There's still actually some trees left. And the things like the grasses and stuff like that are still there. Over here, it looks really different. First of all, you have like the semi-permanent road that's carved through the middle, and it just looks like everything is completely down. So there's no shade, there's no cover, there's nothing left anymore. And so this talks about some of the changes between a natural versus human changes, and then we have to sort them. So an asteroid impact flattening a forest, that's a natural event. Flooding from a dam is a human caused event because it's flooding from the dam. Flooding from a storm would be a natural event. An oil spill would be human because there aren't oil spills without humans around. And the deforestation would be all human because humans are deforesting things. So now we have the Three Gorges Dam, which is a huge dam in you can look it up. It's the world's biggest dam. It's in China, and this talks about some of the pros and cons of it, and some of the pros were um, that it was built along a river that flooded regularly, and so building an enormous dam produces a ton of energy, and the river doesn't flood. At the same time, it made a huge, obviously behind the river, it flooded permanently. So lots of people had to move, and it destroyed lots of land in the process of building it. So we have to sort these into facts and opinions. So the dam provides China with sustainable energy source for producing electrical energy. That's a fact because it 100% is providing sustainable energy that's for electrical energy. The dam is not as fantastic as it first appears. Right? These are all statements from up in here. That's an opinion. It could be more fantastic to some people, or it could be a huge disaster. So that's an opinion, depending on who's reading it. C is it also helps decrease the risk of flooding near the river basin. That's true. That's one of the reasons it was built, was to help decrease flooding. And the worst effect was that people were moved from their villages. That's an opinion, because you could say, maybe 100 people had to move from their villages, but maybe, 25 species went completely extinct. And so you could say, well, maybe the species going totally extinct is worse than people having to move. The people are still alive after all. So using evidence provided, identify two cause-effect relationships involving the construction of the dam. So I said when the dam is built, so then it flooded new land that destroyed the plant and animal life. So that was the cause and effect was you built it, it flooded, and then it killed a bunch of stuff. And the other thing was that they needed lots of concrete to build it. So everywhere they went to get all the stone and everything for the concrete, they disrupted those environments as well. So, exploration 2. What are 3 human factors that affect the environment? Littering, food waste, and using fossil fuels. There's so many things you could say here. So this talks about impacts on the hydrosphere, point source pollution being if you can figure out where it went to, like, oh my gosh, this, chemical company has a tube going from their factory into the river. It's coming from there. Or non-point, where it's kind of like coming from lots of places. An example would be like non-point source pollution would be like when it rains and all of the pollutants from the road, from like oil spills from cars leaking and things like that, gets washed into the water. Like, it's not coming from a place, it's coming from lots of sources. And you could skip this because it's part of the lab. This talks about human impacts on the atmosphere and the geosphere and the biosphere. So, and sums it up here. So this is a picture of a surface mine. And a surface mine is, instead of digging into the ground, they literally just start cutting away from the top, basically. So surface mining changes the shape of the land, so that's the geosphere. The land changes, affect the biosphere, because it's essentially, all land is just dirt now. So it would take a very long time for things to resettle in this area. It exposes new materials to the surface, so that will affect the hydrosphere, because the rain can very easily wash this away. There's no roots or anything holding this in place, whereas everything else has roots and trees and plants and things holding things together. And the process of mining also puts particles into the air, so that's entering the atmosphere. And here we have a small example of how our human impact has affected the Florida panther. And it talks about these Florida panthers and how there used to be tons of them, and then now they're not. And it says, how could the growing human population have affected the Florida panther population? So these are large cats, and they need lots of food, and they need lots of land. So if you're removing their habitat by building your houses, then they don't have a lot of area to live. You're also killing off all of their prey. And I'm sure, as many of us have seen as we drive around, the moment people move into an area, you're probably all going to hit things with your cars, which it actually talks about down here. 24 panthers were killed by cars in 2014. But you're also killing the things that they eat, and you're just disrupting their environment. And then we have this map, and this map says, look at the maps. How do the data in the map support the claim that human activity has negatively affected the population for the Florida panther? And so how do these two maps, when you look at them together, show you that humans really are did affect the population of these panthers. And so what I said was, basically you can see down here the dark purple, which is they're showing down here, right? That's where they live. The light purple, all of this is where they used to live. So then when you look over here on this map, you can see all throughout these states, right? There's like these tiny little specks of light everywhere. Every speck of light is a city. You know, here's major cities. That's probably like Georgia or something. Yeah, and you see in the Louisiana, you see all this. You can see how like Orlando and Tampa are super bright. Miami, this coast is super bright. But if you look at this whole map, the darkest area seems to be basically this region all in here. Okay? The south center of Florida, not near the coast. Well, that's also where they live, and it also includes the national park. So you could kind of easily argue that, you know, this is where they still live because that is the area that seems to be least affected by humans. And then it has this thing about trade-offs, which releases the greatest CO2 designed per year. Higher is more CO2. And then describe the trade-off. And so you can see how as you go down the designs, right, as the cost goes up, it uses less CO2. It's kind of like going down like this, right? As cost increases, the CO2 emissions per year decreases. So the trade-off is you can have less CO2, but you're going to have to pay more per year. That's the trade-off. The scale of human impacts on the environment. So how might human activity that impacts the small area affect a larger area over time? So hopefully you could answer this without reading anything here, but your impact can have a greater change because, you know, maybe you think that, you know, a lot of times you walk down the streets and you see those little signs that say like, hey, don't dump anything down this drain outside your house because this goes somewhere else, right? It goes there, it'll have like the little fish symbol. And it's like, so, you know, they have those because for a long time people would just dump stuff down their drain. They're like, oh, this is just by my house. I'm dumping out the oil from my car or whatever. Not thinking about that gets carried out to a river or to a pond and everyone's stuff kind of gets mixed together and then that pond water goes other places and it eventually goes to the ocean. And so, you know, if you're to do something like dump a tub of oil out onto your street, you know, when you come back a couple weeks later and it's not there, where did that go? Well, it's all over the place now, right? Some of it evaporated, some of it, you know. So even though we're doing something in a small area like a city, we always have to keep in mind how all of those things gets transferred throughout the atmosphere, the geosphere, all these things, they move around. So it affects other areas later on. And so here we have a case study, and this is the Mississippi River. And so you can see how we have a Mississippi River right here. And so this is in the 30s, about 90 years ago, right? And you can see all this light area is the land. And over here, this is 2011, so 80 years later, and there's way less land. Why is there less land here? So one of the reasons why it talks about here is the rising ocean. So one thing that's happened is that the level of the ocean has risen because it's warmed and some of the ice caps have melted. So the level of the ocean has risen, and you imagine if you had this inside of like a tank of water and you started adding up water, it would fill up more and more, and the land's not moving up, right? The land's not floating on the water, so more of the land will get covered up. Other things that contribute are things like human-built structures, such as dams and levees. So dams, one time I watched a whole documentary about why dams are terrible for the environment, and they're good for lots of reasons, but it was fairly compelling. And one of the things that they talked about was how one of the big problems with dams is that rivers, right, the way that beaches and coastlines are made is sediment, right, or loose sand and rock and dirt and stuff gets washed down. So when it snows and it rains in the mountains, the stuff gets carried down by rivers and it gets carried down and it eventually ends up in the ocean and creates beaches and stuff, right? So this is river and eventually all the sediment gets carried out to the ocean and piles up. And that's called deposition. And it's essentially how beaches are formed. Well, if you build a dam, it stops the sediment from going down. So you don't have that anymore. It prevents, so the following effect, what effect will most likely impact the formation of land? That's here, right? They prevent sediments from flowing downstream. Another thing that they have done a lot is build levees. And so levees is good because it's for people that used to live near rivers that would flood regularly. Now, if the river floods regularly, that's really bad to live nearby because your house could get flooded. But the problem with the levees is that now the rivers don't flood, right? And so, in the 30s, this is what it looked like with the rivers flooding all the time. So when the rivers can't flood, they can't deposit all the material. Let's say that the river was flooding out in, this direction all the time. If it's flooding out in this direction, it's always going to be carrying the sediments out in this direction as well. And so that's how you can get all this land filled in over here because the rivers are flooding. But if the rivers don't flood anymore, again, it's not depositing anything. So, and then it talks about down here how the levees and dams of the Mississippi River affect the scale of the human impact on the river and the organisms that depend on it. And so one of the major things you want to take away from this is that you can see how this is a whole giant river system, right? This is the Mississippi River system, basically. The Mississippi River is mainly right here. It goes along here, right? And there's all these other rivers that come along and attach to it at some point, which is why it's called the Mississippi River system. But you can see that the whole thing is riddled with these red marks are dams. So there's dams all throughout, and there's also lots of levees down here. And so what that does is lots of things. First of all, anything that's getting carried down the river somehow has to get around the dam. So a lot of times there's nothing getting deposited out into Louisiana anymore. So Louisiana's coasts are essentially disappearing because there are so many dams, although it doesn't take a lot, it just could take a couple. But we have so many dams here that like the stuff from like the mountains in Colorado, right? All the sediment from the mountains in Colorado can make it all the way down to here. And it hits that dam and it stops. And so it doesn't get carried out to Louisiana anymore. Another thing that happens is, fish can't magically swim through concrete. So lots of fish species, this happens a lot on our coast in like with salmon, but lots of fish might want to come swim up from the ocean up the rivers, but they can't do that if there are dams and things in place, because unless we literally build things or collect them all and move them to the other side of a dam, then they can't go any further. And so, a dam in Louisiana could keep literally all these other states up here. All these other states might not be able to access fish entering from the ocean if Louisiana decided, we don't want to build anything to let the fish get to the other side of the dam. So that, small changes have a major effect. And then it talks about the dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and this kind of goes back to the thing at the beginning. There's this dead zone right here. That's what's highlighted in it's this yellow. The dead zone is not this yellow area. It's down here, which I'm coloring green over here. And what it is this is where the algae blooms would take place. So when the water warms up, there's lots of algae blooms right here. And essentially, all these questions are just getting at the fact that the reason that happens is from fertilizer. So most of the land up here, particularly in, I mean, really a lot in this area, kind of like this area, there's lots of farmland. This is still kind of mountains over here, but there's lots of farmland over here, and they're always fertilized a lot. And so as the fertilizer travels, it gets deposited down into the ocean, and then that fertilizer basically provides food for the algae, and then the algae has a ton of food, so it can, when the water gets warm, it's perfect conditions for the algae, and the algae can reproduce like crazy. This is about cod populations, and you could find these numbers by just wanting the average from 1959 to 1969. So you can kind of like take these points and you add them up and then divide it by 10 because there's 10 years, and you can get these numbers. And the main takeaway from this is that there wasn't anything in place, right? This says, where does it say that? At some point in time, there was a ban that started, so you couldn't fish for cod, but for a long time there were no restrictions on how much cod you could get. So you could see how it just kept, as technology advanced, people just kept catching more and more and more cod, and then it just suddenly dropped really quick, and that is because they were overfishing. So they essentially caught way too many fish for a long time, and then as they kept catching as many fish as they could, they crippled the population, and the cod couldn't reproduce fast enough, and they just kept catching smaller and smaller fish, and that's what happened. So there's not a lot. And then this last thing talks about the effects of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which is in 1986. And essentially, if you don't know the story really well, this kind of talks about it a little bit, but it was a nuclear power plant, and they were doing some tests, and some stuff went wrong, and it essentially exploded. There were like these cones, right? So the nuclear power plant had these radioactive tubes of metal, and they were in a pool, right? And they're in a pool, and there's tons of these things, and they're all like in this pool, and these get really hot, so they radiate heat out from them, right? And then they have to always flush colder and colder water in, and then the water gets really hot, and they use that to make steam. And what happened was something happened, I think, with the water, and so the water got superheated, and then these rods exploded. And when the rods exploded, the rods are made out of radioactive material, which means that the rods are shooting out gamma rays, which is a kind of light. And gamma rays are very damaging to your DNA because they will basically just break your DNA apart. So it's very bad. So what happens with radiation poisoning? All of these things happen with radiation poisoning. It's very bad. How did the radiation spread around? Well, the explosion blew all this radioactive material into ultra tiny bits, and it all got into the air and in clouds and smoke, and so it got carried around all of Europe. And it's so long lasting because it's the actual material, right, that's radioactive. So there's so much of this material that was so highly radioactive, and when it got spread out throughout the area, it got into everything. So the concrete is radioactive, the roads are radioactive, everything's radioactive, the soil's radioactive, and so it's not really good for anything, quite frankly, to live there because it's under such intense radiation a lot of times that, especially if you were close to the actual where the power plant was, you would get sick. But despite that, there's been an explosion of wildlife. So because there's no people, and it's basically just because there's no people there anymore. Because there's no people, there's no cars driving around. You can't go there. I mean, people can kind of go there, but it's pretty restricted. So, it's just like a wilderness, and everything. You can look up pictures of Chernobyl, and it's like a giant city. It's like if Sacramento was completely abandoned tomorrow, and everyone had to leave, and then you went back 20 years later and all the plants had kind of like regrown and grown all over the buildings and things are falling apart. But all the animals would move in because there's no people there to compete with anymore. So, although some of the animals have, lots of them still have health problems because they live there, but the animals aren't necessarily intelligent enough to know that they're having problems because of radioactive material, so they don't know any better. And some changes that were made. I mean, the designs of power plants were changed. A lot of things that they did were like, now they just use computers to manage lots of things. So, yeah. There you go. That is how we can affect the environment in lots of ways.